Good morning. Many thanks to IADA for inviting Megumi Mizumura and myself to give our paper on conserving Michelangelo's Epifania cartoon here today. Although it's only me presenting, it reflects both our work and the work of many colleagues involved in the project over the years. This briefly outlines the structure of our presentation. We will give an overview of the cartoon and the project history, followed by an in-depth look at the current framing decisions. We felt that framing was an important topic to highlight, as it is an integral element of our preservation strategy for Epifania. Epifania was drawn by Michelangelo between 1550 and 1553, and is one of only 2 surviving cartoons by the Renaissance master. Epifania measures just over 2.3 meters in height by 1.7 meters in width. The cartoon was drawn to aid Michelangelo's biographer and fellow artist Asciano Condivi in the production of a panel painting. The painting is seen here on the right. The cartoon consists of 26 overlapping sheets of reale paper, the most common size found in extant Renaissance cartoons. 9 of these sheets are full size, and the remainder are trimmed by varying amounts. The drawing medium is black chalk and charcoal. We see that there is a reasonable correlation between the cartoon and the painting, though they are now slightly different in size, as the cartoon has been trimmed along the left edge. It is speculated that where design changes exist in the painting, it is because Condivi struggled to interpret Michelangelo's frequently redrawn lines. We presume the left edge was trimmed due to irretrievable damage, as it seems likely that the cartoon was accidentally wetted or exposed to damp at some point. Our observations show that the extant left edge is notably weaker when compared to the rest of the cartoon, showing paper delamination and a spongy characteristic. During 2006, an exhibition of Michelangelo drawings prompted the first close examination of the cartoon since the 1980s. The cartoon was deinstalled from permanent display and transported to the Hirayama Conservation Studio, which was one of the few conservation spaces that could accommodate a work of such size. The primary question posed during this assessment was whether the pine panel on which the cartoon was mounted was causing damage. Measurements were taken in multiple sample locations between the cartoon, which has a 19th century paper lining, and the pine panel. The measurements all confirmed that high levels of acetic acid were present. Because of these findings, treating Epifania became a priority, but first space had to be found. The opening of the British Museum's World Conservation and Exhibition Centre enabled Epifania to come to the new studio in 2018, and it was then that the conservation project commenced. Lifting the cartoon from the pine panel was the first treatment objective. Examination found that the cartoon's 19th century lining was directly adhered at the front edges of the panel, and that this attachment was reinforced by layers of paper tape and linen. The bottom layer of paper tape was directly adhered onto the recto of the cartoon, overlapping the cartoon edges by up to 2 centimeters. To lift the cartoon, all paper tapes and linen were peeled away in individual layers. It was possible to remove some layers dry using a scalpel and tweezers, whilst other layers required the adhesive to be softened using brush application of water. Where the lining was directly adhered to the panel, it was undercut using a scalpel. The completion of all of these stages enabled the cartoon to be lifted. Another major focus of the project was to create a detailed digital record for Epifania. This included making a digital condition map, as seen on screen, and in capturing direct light, UV, and infrared photography. We also collaborated with the Factum Foundation, who used high-resolution 3D scanning to digitize the surface of the cartoon, providing us with a multi-layered viewing tool. To better understand Epifania as a functional drawing, we carried out practical research in the making and use of Renaissance cartoons. Referring to texts on Renaissance workshop practice, we made several cartoons and used them to try and answer questions we had about Epifania. We wanted to understand how Epifania's cartoon sheet was prepared, as it showed a complex series of under and overlapping joins. We suggest that the formation of the large sheet was by initially preparing smaller groups of paper. We think that 2 pieces of reale paper were adhered together, followed by the joining of 2 pairs into a rectangular group of 4. Groups of 4 were then joined to another group of 4, with the sheet increasing to the desired size and shape. This method fits with the joins seen in Epifania, but also reflects an expedient approach for workshop assistance, and therefore may have had widespread use. We also wanted to find out how the design may have been transferred for Condivi's painting, as Epifania shows no evidence of pricking or stylus marks. Because no physical trace remains, we think that a substitute or secondary cartoon must have been made. Our trials showed that by using an interleaving charcoal blackened paper, it is possible to successfully transfer a design to a substitute without leaving a trace. For example, using charcoal paper, we were able to boost the copy of the central drawing by very lightly running a bone folder over the design. A final comment for the 2018 to 2019 phase of the project is to say that there was wide consultation, which included 2 international expert meetings. Invited guests included Renaissance cartoon experts, international conservators, and paper historians. All guests generously shared their experience and built a forum where findings and potential treatment options were discussed. In 2022, following the pandemic and the retirement of the 3 senior conservators working on Epifania, the project was handed to Mizumura and to myself to complete. As we had not previously been involved in the project, a large part of our initial work was going through the existing material to familiarise ourselves with what was known about the cartoon, what research had already been carried out, and what treatment had been completed. We were especially interested in the provenance history of Epifania, as we felt that it may be a key to unlocking greater understanding of the cartoon's current condition. There were tantalising glimpses of information. For example, archival records told us that the cartoon was within a walnut frame as early as the 16th century. The provenance information shows that from 1564 until 1824 that the cartoon was in Italy, largely passing down through family or fortuitous connection. In 1824, having appeared on the art market, Epifania travelled to the UK and became part of the Thomas Lawrence collection. A very satisfying piece of research showed that Epifania travelled to the Netherlands between 1838 and 1850, when the cartoon was purchased by King Willem II. Although this information was within several art history texts, the information had not been known to our curators, and we therefore added to the British Museum's provenance record. Epifania returned to the UK in 1850 and ultimately was donated to the British Museum, becoming formally acquired in 1895. Of the previous owners, Samuel Woodburn was especially interesting. He had acquired Epifania for Thomas Lawrence in 1824, owned it himself between 1834 to 38, and again owned Epifania from 1850 until his death in 1853. It was not the frequency with which Samuel Woodburn owned the cartoon that we found most interesting, but the reach which he and his 3 brothers, William, Alan and Henry, had in the 19th century art world. From the 1810s until the 1850s, the Woodburn brothers had a thriving business as picture and master drawing dealers, print publishers, and perhaps most interestingly, as frame makers and picture restorers. A final piece of research on Samuel Woodburn shows that he sold coloured paper. This was especially interesting, as Epifania's 19th century lining is made with a brown paper. This brown paper cannot have been applied earlier than around 1850, which coincides with the second time that Samuel Woodburn owned Epifania, as scientific analysis confirms the presence of wood pulp. Paper historian Peter Bauer has identified it as a mid-19th century machine-made paper which was possibly used for wrapping. We think it is possible that the lining was applied by the Woodburns during their second ownership, as we know that their business had both the materials and the skills to do so. These thoughts are speculation, but it is exciting to unearth so many coincidences related to an intervention that has had a significant impact on the current condition of Epifania. Another primary area of research was to build the history of Epifania at the British Museum. Here, we were surprised to find very little information. After being formally acquired in 1895, reportedly within an oak frame, we are confident in assuming that Epifania has been on near continuous permanent display. We are confident in this because it has consistently been viewed as one of the highlights of the entire museum, and because its size has always posed a storage problem. The first image we have of Epifania at the museum was taken for Johannes Wilder's 1953 catalogue of Italian drawings. We presume that the photograph was captured in the 1950s, shortly before the publication of the catalogue. The first conservation record for Epifania, a condition report, is dated to 1987. By this date, Epifania was without the oak frame it arrived in and was displayed within a wall case. We do not know when the frame was disposed of, but the testimony of a former staff member suggests that the frame's glass smashed in the 1950s, and therefore the change seems likely to have occurred after this date. In 2006, Epifania was given a new display solution when London framers Arnold Wiggins and Sons were commissioned to make a new frame, a carved frame made of jelly-tong wood which was glazed with 6.6mm TrueView glass. Epifania remained in this frame until conservation began in 2018. Although the early British Museum record was sparse, with careful observation it was possible to extract important condition information. The photos left to right are sequential in the cartoon's photographic record, and what is especially interesting is that they attest to an undocumented conservation intervention. If we look at the Wilder catalogue images on the left, it is possible to see holes which are the result of fixing the cartoon to a strainer. For clarity, the locations of the tacking holes have been highlighted with a red X. If we compare this detail to the next known photographs shown on the right, we can see that the tacking holes are no longer visible and there is less space at the edge of the drawing. This shows that the edges of the cartoon were therefore covered with the paper and linen tapes that reinforced the mounting at an undocumented date between the early 1950s and 1987. I will now move on to discuss a major focus of the current project, namely the remounting and framing of Epifania. Having lifted Epifania from the pine panel, a following treatment objective was the provision of a new conservation-grade panel. Owing to the size of the cartoon, we quickly realised that there was no material in which a single sheet could meet the dimensions of Epifania. This was a hugely complicating factor and proved significant in our process of deciding which material we should use. We needed a solution that not only stayed flat in its own right, especially when the pull forces associated with mounting act on the panel, but we also needed to ensure that we had a material that could be exactly and robustly joined to give a perfectly flat finish. We discounted paperboard materials such as Tycor, as we had previous experience of them warping over such large formats, even when counted on the verso. Therefore, we had to look outside of our familiar materials. With this in mind, we sought expertise from our colleagues at the National Gallery in London, as the production of large-scale panels is a routine part of their work. They recommended Cellite, which they use for their paintings and also for their Leonardo cartoon, the so-called Burlington House cartoon. Cellite has the advantage of being inert, rigid, stocked in 2 depths, and with various sheet finishes. A final consideration is that it is significantly lighter than a solid pine panel. We quickly realised that precisely joining the 2 Cellite sheets to form the panel was beyond our expertise. We therefore subcontracted the production of a panel to an external technician who has extensive experience in this work. The 2 sheets were joined using dacrylite-sealed pine wood battens, which were inserted into slots created by channeling out the Cellite's honeycomb core with a hammer and chisel. Slots were located at the outer edges and as a central tongue join. Battens were then adhered into position with a permabond adhesive. The whole process was carried out in such a way as to ensure that the resulting surface is completely flat. The difference between the National Gallery's panels and ours is that we are fully encapsulating the Cellite with 2200 micron buffered museum board. Although this will add to the weight of the panel, we wanted to add extra buffering material to be in direct contact with the cartoon. A primary layer of mount board will fully encapsulate the panel, whilst a secondary layer of mount board will be applied to the recto and sides only. The primary layer of mount board will be adhered with araldite, an epoxy resin. An epoxy adhesive has been chosen for this job due to the superior bond it offers, and this is especially important given that we expect Epifania to exert a significant pull force when mounted. The secondary layer of mount board will be adhered with wheat starch. This image shows our conservation mounters in the process of applying this layer to a smaller test panel of the same construction. Tests using this panel are ongoing, and we are looking at both the materials and construction of the panel and also how we will mount the cartoon. For example, whether we attach to the recto or to the verso of the panel. A new frame was required in conjunction with the Cellite panel, as it was agreed that the uncovered edges of Epifania should now be shown. To achieve this, a larger frame aperture and ultimately a larger frame were needed. We discussed our framing options with many institutions, but especially the National Gallery in London. Their expertise in framing large format works guided us to choose an aluminium display case with a separate veneer frame. We subsequently employed an experienced contractor to design the display case, oversee the production, and coordinate all aspects related to the framing and gallery installation. The display case will provide all the structural elements to support the mounted cartoon, will provide tighter climactic control, and will provide handling solutions for the safe movement of what will be an extremely heavy object. On this final point, it is worth saying that we estimate the weight of the whole system to be no less than 300 kilograms. The veneer frame simply acts as a false frame which fits over the aluminium case and has a purely aesthetic role. And this slide shows an example of a veneer frame and its corresponding display case. Here we see the design for our Epifania display case. The display case, which is made of aluminium, is formed of a main frame and 3 subframes which fit inside of the main frame. The role of the subframes is to make each component independent of each other, enabling the safest and easiest removal from the case. A is the main frame into which subframes B to D are fitted. B is the subframe which will hold the glass glazing, and the glass that we have chosen is 8.8mm true view laminated glass. C is the subframe into which the cartoon, mounted on the cellite panel, will be fitted, and D is the subframe at the back of the main frame that retains all other subframes in position. It pairs with a wall-mounted hanging bracket, which will hang the entire display case and the veneer frame. And this slide shows the relationship between the retaining ring subframe and the hanging bracket, which will be used for display. Here we see a profile view of the frame and subframes, which is perhaps slightly easier to understand. The front of the display case is the right of the diagram, and included within this view is where Epifania sits within the structure, and the powder-coated aluminium spacer, which will separate the glazing from the cartoon. A marble seal package will be made around the glass retainer subframe and the panel subframe to tightly control the environmental conditions surrounding the cartoon. This is an important detail, as the gallery Epifania will return to on permanent display has environmental conditions which fluctuate across the year. Within the marble seal package, we will embed a handwell sensor to closely monitor the environmental conditions immediately surrounding the cartoon. The sensor will be inserted through a hole made in the frame spacer. We approached the head of framing at the National Gallery to produce the veneer display frame and were delighted that they accepted the project. 4 bespoke frames were offered, each containing carved details which reflected the 16th century context of the cartoon. And of the 4, we selected the frame outlined in red. The frame includes carving typical of the 16th century and outthrown corners which reflect details seen in Michelangelo's architectural drawings. The surface of the frame is made from European walnut, and the structural elements will be made from either pine or Italian poplar. A sample corner has already enabled the aesthetics to be refined. For example, how distressed the gilding should be, and how dark to take the wood stain. It also provides a means to define precisely how and where it should be attached to the display case. Before finishing this presentation, I am very aware I should provide a brief update of the conservation of Epifania itself. At the point of submitting the abstract for this presentation, we remained in the decision-making stage of how to treat the cartoon. 2 approaches were considered, either very minimal or highly interventive. It was not clear which represented the safest and most ethical option. We could only equip ourselves to answer our questions by assessing the verso of the cartoon, which had not been accomplished before. In looking at the verso, we needed to assess whether the quality and attachment of the lining paper offered sufficient support in a new mounting scenario, and what challenges we would face if we removed it. At the end of 2022, we achieved the important step of turning Epifania over for the first time. Full assessment of the verso showed that the lining paper was lower quality than thought in 2018. It is very short-fibred, showed evidence of fracturing, and has inclusions such as large pigment particles, rope fibres, and straw. Removed fragments of the lining paper were tested and found to leach colour on prolonged contact with water, making it a huge risk should there be a flood. Finally, it was clear that several air pockets existed between the cartoon and the lining paper, undermining the assumed level of support. Therefore, at the start of 2023, we decided that removing the lining was the best course of action to ensure the preservation of Epifania. As seen on the right, the brown lining paper has now been removed, revealing the verso of the cartoon immediately underneath. Temporary repairs were made to support the cartoon during this process. A thick starch and animal glue is applied across the entirety of the verso, and there are many unsuitable historic repairs. We are currently working to remove both, though the degraded nature of the paper is making this extremely difficult. In the coming months, we will continue progressing the cartoon towards a new lining, which will enable the mounting and framing. The cartoon will be exhibited in a British Museum temporary exhibition next May, so we have a very tight deadline to achieve this work. The practical conservation of Epifania is a huge undertaking. It is the largest drawing in the British Museum's collection, and is by far the most technically challenging treatment our team has ever faced. If IARDA is willing to have us back in a few years' time, we would love to discuss the details of the conservation with you, but until then, wish us luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Questions? Now is the time to ask. Can you please, before we get started, again, introduce yourself, just quick name and institution, country.
Good morning, Emma. This is Frank Mowry from Florida, USA. Couple questions. During your examination of this piece, were there any indications on how Michelangelo might have drawn it, being such a large format? Would he have mounted it to a wall and done his drawings? Would he have mounted it to a panel, perhaps? Were there any kind of indications that might have led to how he physically drew such a large piece?
Well, we don't have any evidence from the cartoon itself, but Renaissance workshop practice, texts on Renaissance workshop practice indicate that it could either be drawn in an upright position, so attached to a wall or a panel, or on the floor. There are pluses and minuses to both points. So obviously if it's upright, it's easier to see the whole composition, to sort of draw it sort of in a more full sense, but you need equipment such as scaffolding. Right. If it's on the floor, you have the detraction of potentially kneeling over it and sort of having difficulty in reaching the centre. We don't have any evidence, but we did trial both ways. We also trialled how it might have been transferred in such a large format, and we thought it would be possible to unroll the cartoon as we were sort of using a charcoal blackened interleaving layer to transfer to a secondary cartoon. So we thought that might be a possibility for the substitute, but there's no obvious answer for how he actually drew it.
Okay. One other question about your framing. You're enclosing it into a Marvel seal package, but I didn't hear you suggest that there might be some art sorb or silica gel mounted into it to accommodate the fluctuations that you said will be happening in the exhibition hall. Is that something you would consider?
We are going to use, because we're using so much buffering mount board, we think that that will be sufficient. We will also carefully control the marble seal package when we make it, so we will set it to our particular desired humidity level. And then the handwall sensor itself will provide details on how well that package is performing. And if we need to remake the package, we'll have that data really clearly and readily just from embedding the handwall sensor into it.
Any other questions?
So hello, my name is Tara Laubach, and I'm from the Zentrum für Bucherhaltung in Leipzig, the Center for Book Restoration, and my question is related to exactly how the cartoon will be mounted onto this aluminium board. So will it be glued directly onto it? That I didn't really understand that fully.
So we're using the cellulite panel, which will be encapsulated with mount board, so we can use our traditional adhesives, but we're still in the process of working out exactly how we will do that. So we are looking at whether we make an attachment to the recto or to the verso, and whether we use simply a lining which is extended margins, or whether we apply separate margins onto the edges of the lining and then wrap them around either to the back or do we make the attachment to the front. We have a test panel which is just over half the size of the cartoon, so a significant size. And we've made cartoons which mirror the exact same structure of the cartoon using papers of similar degraded nature, although obviously we don't have a kind of mid-16th century paper to trial on. But we are really robustly looking at how we are going to do it and what is the best mounting solution. But we are not quite there yet because the conservation has proved much more challenging than we anticipated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Wir haben noch Zeit für ein paar Fragen, wenn ihr noch Fragen habt.
Yes, thank you. This is Tessa Rietveld, Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam. I have a question about the epoxy resin you use. Do you have any idea about the performance? Because it's going to be climatized and it's inside this pocket.
Absolutely. So we've body tested all of the materials that we were using in the within the kind of the frame and mounting structures, and they all passed within a Marvel Seal sort of package scenario. So we are confident that it will perform, that they are conservation grade, and we also are confident in the bond that it offers because we have to rely on our experienced colleagues at the National Gallery who frequently use it. So we are fairly certain that it will be a sufficiently suitable adhesive for such a strong pull force, which is what we're fully anticipating Epifania will exert. But again, that's one of the things that our test panel will confirm, hopefully.
Hello, Veronika Schrieder, States Archive, Saxonia, Sächsisches Staatsarchiv. What will happen to the lining paper from the 19th century? You removed it, but it tells a story in itself, so will you keep it? Will you tell the story?
Yeah, absolutely. We obviously we took extensive photographs prior to removing it, and we have significant sections of the lining paper that we removed and will keep for the record. It will be kept alongside the condition records, which we have sort of many hard copies at the British Museum, so we will store it there. The lining paper itself we couldn't remove sort of very cleanly because it had a sporadically very quite strong attachment to the verso of the cartoon, and variously where there were air pockets, not so good an attachment. And where there were air pockets, we kept the large sections, and we'll refer to those and we can do further testing on those should we need to. But it was exactly the removal that enabled us to confirm that it was the right decision. So seeing that there were air pockets, seeing that it leached colour, which would have been a huge problem in a flooding scenario, was really useful to have.